Welcome, everyone. My name is Lisa Ryers, and I'm one of the co-presidents of the Brown Club of Greater San Francisco. So, our mission is alumni engagement with the over 4,000 alums that live in our region. Since March, we've obviously made it to the virtual world, but it's been funny because one of the few solaces we've had this year is just being able to escape through books and have armchair travel at times. And with that in mind, book clubs have really prospered, really. And we've been really lucky that every month we've been able to engage with a Brown author in our area and have them chime in with how they work their art. So welcome, Michael. I'm going to go ahead and do a short intro. What I like to do is usually do the intro from the author's Twitter account, because I always feel like it's very concise and self-written. And I really liked Michael's. He has Michael David Lukas, writer, eater, reader, spy. So maybe that's a little Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy reference, perhaps. I don't know, but in addition to this, he has been a Fulbright scholar in Turkey, a night shift proofreader in Tel Aviv, a student at the American University in Cairo, and a waiter at Red Loaf Writers Conference in Vermont. He is the author of The Oracle of Istanbul, 2011, and The Last Watchman of Old Cairo, 2018. His writing has also appeared in the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, Slate, National Geographic Traveler, and Georgia Review. He lives in Oakland and teaches at San Francisco State. So welcome, Michael. I'll just be asking you a couple questions, and then I'm definitely just going to open the floor to everyone here. I'm sure they have questions of their own. So what we like to do is kind of a standard question for these events is ask, were you already writing back in the day in Providence in Brown? Was that something that you were already doing?
I was. It's interesting to sort of think about the arc of my writing career, but like connected to Brown. I guess what I would say about that is when I started off at college, I was really interested in being a poet, and took a couple. I don't know if any of you guys were creative writing concentrators, or I guess at my point it was just a certificate or something, or a minor. I don't know what we even called it, but back in the day, or maybe still now, anyone could get into the introductory classes, but you had to apply to get into the intermediate or advanced classes. And I took an intermediate poetry class and then just kept kind of hitting the wall of that application for the intermediate classes and never got in. And so then at a certain point I was like, well, I might as well try fiction. And I tried fiction and have stuck with it ever since. And so I'm very thankful for whoever it was that led me into that fiction class. And also, I guess, to the poets who didn't let me into their poetry class. I wasn't writing very good poetry, so it's fair enough. And then I really started writing in earnest when I was my junior year, and I was studying abroad in Cairo, and then in the second semester in Tel Aviv. And that was when I first got into my writing practice, and it's actually where I first had the idea for this book, The Last Watchman of Old Cairo. I was living in Cairo, studying Arabic at the American University, but most of my days I was just kind of wandering around the city, soaking it all in, enjoying, the kind of beautiful, decrepit, sublime, polluted, welcoming, crazy traffic city that it is. And I just loved it. I was just kind of eating it all up. And the one kind of disjuncture though for me was that I couldn't really square my Jewish and American identity with the identity of being someone who was living in and really enjoying and loving Cairo. And it wasn't until a couple months in that I happened upon this graveyard in a neighborhood called Old Cairo, and I wandered through the graveyard, started noticing, some Jewish names, and then noticing some Jewish stars, and then finally seeing the synagogue that this graveyard was attached to, just kind of looming up. And I remember overhearing a tour guide talking about 1,000 years of Jewish life in Cairo. And at that point, I didn't really know much of anything about the Jews of Cairo. And so that phrase just kind of like hit me like a ton of bricks, but a ton of very welcome bricks, because I was, so glad to be able to feel like I fit into some kind of larger history as a Jew in Cairo, and that it wasn't an oxymoron to be a Jewish person who felt connected to the city. And so that experience kind of sparked this interest in this community, in this history. And I went back and for my senior thesis wrote the beginning of a novel about an American Jew, one of these sort of lightly veiled Romana clefs about an American Jew studying abroad in Cairo. And it wasn't really working, and I ended up setting it aside and coming back to it much later. But that was the kind of impetus of it, and the early seed was definitely planted at Brown and those writing classes.
Wow, so maybe Brown can take a little credit for being somewhat of a impetus or foundation for you that way, which is great.
Sure.
Can you talk a little bit more about how you focused on making the Watchmen kind of the focal point for your piece? I pulled out this quote, which I really loved. A watchman was more than just a guard. He was the spirit of the place, the embodiment of the building in human form. So you were talking about kind of walking around Cairo and kind of looking at these structures. And I really love the way that this person seems to personify that kind of the elements of Cairo in that human form. Can you talk a little more about that?
Yeah, sure. I guess there's two things. First is that, when I was there and when I came back and visited in future years, all throughout the city, there's guys, and it's almost 100% guys standing in front of buildings. They could be, oftentimes they're security guards. They're kind of like private security guards in these little booths, similar to a lot of the sort of security guard booths you'll see in a lot of places in the developing world. And they're just kind of sitting in these booths and kind of guarding these buildings. And then there's a position, I guess you'd call it, called Bawab, which literally means doorman, or but it's not like a doorman like you have in New York or something. It's a guy who is like living in the foyer of a building, and oftentimes there's like a little closet on the side that they sleep in, and they spend almost all their time there, and they kind of do, they'll run out and buy groceries for people. They serve as kind of like a marketing agent, I guess, for the building. Like if you're looking for a building, you go around, talk to all the doormen, all the boabs. And they also serve as a kind of morality police. If you're trying to, if you're an unmarried person trying to bring someone up to your apartment, they'll stop you, for better or for worse. And so I got really interested in what's it mean that all these buildings have people kind of like watching over them, sitting in front of them. So that was one piece. And then the other piece about the Watchmen is that the second half to the story of sort of where the book came from is that after I finished my first book and it was gonna, be published, sort of casting around for what I was gonna write next. And around that time, I happened to get on a cross-country plane flight. I forget where I was going, but it was a long flight. And I was walking down the aisle to my seat, and there was this distinguished looking middle-aged South Asian woman sitting in the seat next to mine. So I sat down, said hi to her. We started chatting, and I like to say that there's two kinds of people in the world. There's those people who like to talk on airplanes, and those people who don't. And I'm very firmly in the don't. And she was, as it became really clear quickly, is very much in the do category. And so she was much more persistent than I was, avoidant. And so she got me talking. She turned out to be a really interesting and engaging person. She moved from Calcutta to Madison when she was a young woman with her husband, who was going to UW. And, had all these stories about that. And then I started telling her about my book, and she was really excited. She was Muslim and was really excited about the sort of Muslim-Jewish connections of my first book. And then she started talking about her distant cousins who were, I guess still are, Watchmen, Bengali Muslims who are Watchmen of the synagogues in Calcutta. And so, when she said this, I was kind of like, oh, like now I kind of get what was missing from the initial draft of this book. Like the initial draft was so narrow, it was so much about me and my experience. And I kind of realized in one fell swoop that the book I was trying to write was actually a broader book about, this long history, but more than that, about a long history of this community's relationship with the majority Muslim community in Cairo, and what that kind of back and forth was like, and what it means to live in a multi-ethnic society. And so I kind of excused myself from this conversation, took one of those little cocktail napkins that they have on airplanes, and like went to the bathroom and scribbled down some notes so I wouldn't forget it. Because, if any of you are writers or anything, then that like those moments of epiphany are rare, and you have to capture them. And so that was sort of the other piece of the Watchmen thing, was this kind of fortuitous connection that I had with this woman, and this very real set of Watchmen in Calcutta. And then I since learned, I used to work at the Center for Middle East Studies at UC Berkeley, and there was a visiting scholar from UCLA who's a really, really cool guy, a Moroccan, who from the sort of like far out Sahara, who writes about, an anthropologist who writes about Moroccan memories of the Jewish past. And what he said is that it's actually very common in Morocco and other places in North Africa that there's a Muslim watchman of a Jewish saint's tomb or a synagogue or a graveyard or what have you. And so that made me feel like validated that it wasn't just this weird thing I'd kind of like glommed onto, that it's actually somewhat common.
Interesting, yeah. Yeah, it's interesting too, the way that the stories are connected, but then their voices are separate with kind of a third person and a first person point of view. Were those elements always in play in that way, or did you kind of experiment a little bit and then arrive at one or the other?
I when I started writing it, it was kind of this humongous book of like 10 parts, with one part for every century of Jewish life in Cairo. And I, started writing that, and then I I realized that it wasn't something that I wanted to write, and probably not something that anyone wanted to read. So then I sort of, with each draft, I started narrowing it down more and more and more until I got to those three. And I knew that I wanted the three to be distinct, like to have distinct voices and to have distinct points of view. Because I wanted it to kind of mirror this hodgepodge that's, there's this Geniza, this cache of documents at the kind of center of the book, and I wanted it to mirror that kind of eclecticism.
Yeah, I think that seemed very successful, and kind of just a very interesting tapestry, the way the voices kind of get more personal and kind of distant. And just when, even with the sisters, I noticed with Margaret and her sister, the twins, the story there, it starts out with them kind of debating with the innkeeper about how the room they requested was not the facing in the right direction they wanted. And, I have that click of E.M. Forrester's Room with the View, and, that kind of just living in that time period and that space just right away. It was really interesting. I also kind of obviously really appreciated just having lived here a long time, and also having lived in Berkeley, just all of the Berkeley-ness, and how you seem to separate that world as kind of a headspace world, and then going over to the Middle East and going to Egypt as being more of a physical world, and obviously a place where Joseph could also explore his sexuality. Was that something that you discovered along the way, or?
Not really. I mean, I haven't really thought of that sort of like mind-body, dichotomy for it. In terms of Joseph's sexuality, that's mostly kind of connected to a friend of mine who also a Brown grad who was living in Cairo at the same time, who's a gay man, and just sort of talking to him about his romantic, life in Cairo, and being really fascinated with how that worked, and how it worked to cruise and, pick guys up, and, that it was all kind of on the down low, but it was very much present. I mean, I'm, straight, but, was definitely solicited many times in Cairo and in Tunis, actually, when I lived there. And that's almost never happened to me in the United States. But I'd be walking down the street and I'd be, get sort of like comments inviting me to, take things elsewhere, as it were. But so I was really interested with how that worked in that place, and how it was different from the way sexuality for gay men worked in the United States, and what it would be like to be an Egyptian American and be like, okay, I've had this one kind of like experience with sexuality, and then I go to Cairo and have a very different one. I don't know if any of you ever seen the show Rami on I don't know, it's on Hulu. It's about a like Muslim American guy, Egyptian American, who lives in New Jersey, and kind of people say it's like the millennial, I don't know, Muslim Philip Roth or something like that. But anyways, there's some scenes where he goes to Cairo, and he's sort of going to Cairo to get his to connect with his identity, and I just loved the ways that he was exploring his sexuality as a straight guy in this space, and how it was different. Than it just really made me think of my own process and sort of thinking through all that. Anyways.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, it's funny because, you place it, the whole story, in 2000 in Berkeley, and the Bush and Gore lawn signs in places, although in Berkeley there probably weren't too many Bush signs, but that, you know, and now I see you have your I voted little decal on your shirt there. So yeah.
My students benefit.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I think I see here from Victoria that a request, I don't want to put you on the spot, but she asks if perhaps you could read a little bit for us. I don't know if you have something that you might have selected. But while you're spinning, I can also kind of open it up to others here to also ask you questions. So whatever you would like to do first.
I can just read since I have it.
Awesome.
Unmute you.
What are you doing here?
I'm unmuting you. Okay. We have questions.
We have questions.
All right, well, it sounds like he's gonna have something to read.
Right, okay,
Okay.
of course.
Yeah. I'll just read a couple pages and then I can answer questions. I'm just gonna read the first couple pages here. A long, long time ago, before Mubarak and the revolution, before Sadat and Begin, before Nasser, the free officers and the Suez crisis, before Herzl, before Dreyfus, before Solomon Schechter and the Cambridge University Library, before Ismail Pasha and Muhammad Ali Pasha, before the British, the French, the Ottomans, the Mamluks and the Ayyubids, before the Great Plague and Saladin, before Maimonides, the great sage, may his memory be a blessing. Our story begins before all this, in the reign of El-Mustansir, when Cairo was still two cities and the Jews but a tribe among them. It was late summer in the 4800th year of creation, 4 centuries after Muhammad's migration to Medina, and more than 1,000 years after the birth of Jesus. The Nile had crested a few days earlier, and its entire shallow valley shone with damp brilliance. Beneath the purple silhouetted swoop of storks, the clang of an eager blacksmith mingled with the call to prayer and the smell of baking bread. That particular morning, there was another smell too, something sharp and unfamiliar at first. No one could put a name on it until, bleary-eyed and still warm from bed, they stepped out into the day and saw that neat black thread of smoke rising from the Ibn Ezra synagogue. Before long, a crowd gathered in the courtyard of the synagogue, women and children, dyers and glass blowers, pharmacists, money changers, and fishermen. For most, this was their first glimpse of the newly reconstructed synagogue, still unfinished, still unconsecrated by prayer, and already this beautiful new building was blackened by fire. It was a terrible thing, and yet it could have been worse. Apart from the smell of smoke in the prayer hall, the damage was limited to a shadow of soot beneath the scaffolding where the fire had started. Who would do such a thing? Some more hopeful members of the crowd thought they saw signs of an accident, a stray coal, or a clumsy housewife. Others insisted that the fire would turn out to be the work of petty vandals. And then there were those who regarded it as something more sinister, a reminder and a portent of things to come. Not that anyone needed reminding. Who could forget the reign of El-Hakim the Horrible? Who did not shiver to think of that sister-loving false prophet who had destroyed nearly a dozen synagogues and churches, including the original Ibn Ezra? Who could forget that hateful despot who had gone so far as to outlaw molochia, the leafy green vegetable also known as Jew's mallow? He was gone now, El-Hakim, dead for nearly 20 years, and the current caliph, El-Mustansir, had proven himself to be a friend of the Jews. Still, one never knew. I'm just going to stop there.
Great, thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, great to just again have some kind of travel, time travel and geographical travel is just much, much appreciated. Very and beautifully rendered. Yeah, I see there is one other question here in chat. Carol writes, "It's a wonderful book. What are you working on now?" Parentheses, I can't resist asking whether the twins are close to real.
The twins are close to real. They're definitely based on real historical people. Agnes Lewis and Margaret Smith, or anyways, maybe reversed. Anyways, they're very much based on the real people, and I did a lot of research to try and get that right. And they did, you know, basically most of the things that happened in the book happened. They describe in their journals. There's some things I made up, definitely, and I may have given them a bit more credit than they actually deserve. That's what a librarian who studies this episode in history, when they were when these people from Cambridge were coming to sort of take the Geniza documents, she said that I kind of, you know, should give Solomon Schechter a little more credit, and I did when she gave me that feedback. But I think that, anyways, I think that because it's from their perspective, it sort of makes sense that the credit is a little bit more outsized than it is in real life. But they're fascinating, and if you're interested in reading more about them, there's a great book called The Sisters of Sinai that's about them. They also play a pretty big role in the book Sacred Trash, which is about the Geniza documents in general. And it's a lot about Solomon Schechter and, you know, the sort of scholars that came after him, but the twins are definitely a big part of it. And it was really fun writing them because they're just so, you know, so full of personality and, you know, contradictions and you know, which is really interesting women. Like what do you do if you're a Scottish Presbyterian female millionaire in, like, you know, 1895? Like, what are your, you know, you have so many limitations on you, but then at the same time you have so much at your disposal. And they chose to pursue a life of the mind and, you know, also a life of adventure, which I think is pretty cool, even if, you know, they did plunder the Middle East for documents.
Yeah.
You can see it from
a little kind of Lonely Planet gone awry, perhaps, back in the day. Yeah, and Carol also asked you if you were working on anything right now.
Oh yeah, thank you. I just finished a draft of my third book, which is a retelling of the biblical book of Esther, set in a kind of post-apocalyptic future. So I don't know really what to compare it to, but it's a little like, it's got like a little Italo Calvino vibe. It's got a little, it feels like a little bit like Dune, I think, but it's not really technologically advanced.
Yeah, no worms. No worms, right?
No worms, no.
When you're talking, no worms.
The question about Mona Takhtawi, I think, I don't know why she follows me on Twitter. I know we have a good friend in common, Rabia Al-Madin, who's a writer in San Francisco. So I assume that's why she does, not because I have anything interesting to say.
Yeah, and it looks like Jane had a follow-up about the twins. How did the twins deal with their work credited to others?
They got really upset about it. They, you know, and they did what was at their disposal at the time, which was write letters to the Times of London and, write books about, their side of the story. I think that, in reality, I don't think they would have felt like their work. I mean, they did discover the Geniza documents, but Solomon Schechter was really the expert. He was the person who identified when they brought the documents back from Cambridge, from Cairo to Cambridge originally. He was the person who identified, what it was. He was the person who sort of like knew that it might be a portent of something larger. So I don't know if they would feel like given short shift for that. But with the Sinai palimpsest, which they mention a couple times in the book, they really did get their credit stolen from them by the male professor who was leading the expedition that they were on. They really did discover this document, and the guy took credit for it. So, and they were upset, and they wrote letters to the Times, and they wrote books about their perspective. But I don't know what they would say about the Geniza. I'd be kind of interested. I mean, I spent a lot of time kind of imagining what they would say, but I'd be interested to hear what they would say in reality.
So on a related thread, there's a lot of reality in this book. And I'm curious if you could talk more about your experience researching and where you went for information and how that process went working with the librarians and digging around through these histories.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, with all my books, I have kind of had a sort of initial big burst of research right off the bat when I'm kind of exploring the terrain, as it were. And, I'll read super widely. I got this grant from SFSU, and then I was going to go on a research trip to New Haven, but that got canceled because of COVID. So I had like $1,500 that I was just sitting there, and it was going to expire. So I was like, I'm going to buy a bunch of books for my next project. So I just bought, and I was like, and I'll support a local bookstore while I'm at it. So I just bought 50 some odd books for my next book to sort of do that research. So it's just I'll read super widely. Like for my next book, my fourth book, I was had this research assistant, and I was like, I want a list of books about Dracula and spies in World War I, and Mandate Palestine, and Skull and Bones, and I just had this crazy list of things that I was trying to research, and so that's kind of what it's like with every book. And with the last Watchmen, it was with the contemporary section, I kind of had my own experience to fall back on. With the 19th century section, I had the sisters wrote a number of books about their experience, and there's a couple books written about them, so I had that. And then for the 11th century section, there's this amazing work of scholarship called A Mediterranean Society that is 6 volumes of kind of sociological, economic, political history of the Cairo Jewish community in the 10th to 13th centuries. And it's all based on the Geniza documents. It's all based on these documents that were found in the synagogue. And basically this dude and his research assistants, Esti Goitin, just read as much of the documents as they could and extrapolated all this information from it. Because it's not like a diary, like today I paid 20 dirham for whatever bowl of, koshery or something. It's all receipts and contracts and, things. People didn't just write anything down. They wrote only things down that were important. And a list of things that are in women's dowries, so he took all these sort of ephemera of daily life and from that created this amazing, work of scholarship. I mean, it's crazy, this book. It's like, there's an appendix, an index that's this thick. And, so it's kind of a novelist's like dream, but also nightmare, because like any piece of material information you could just find, right? You could just find what their bathrooms look like. You can find what their cookware looks like. You can find how much a bolt of cotton costs. There's like all of this information that's at your disposal. And it can be a little overwhelming sometimes. So at certain points, I would just, after I did the initial research, I'd just take a step back, let it all kind of marinate, write, and then when it was over, kind of went back and saw what I needed to like fact check and what T's I needed to cross and what I's I needed to dot.
Thanks.
Karen, are you a librarian, or are you just kind of or you just have an interest?
Just a book nerd. I think I would find the research part of being a writer the most exciting part, and the temptation to just keep reading more and more of the research would probably stop me from ever getting my work done. So I'm just curious to hear your perspective about it, especially since this book had that, especially the Victorian era one had that rather accurate history, and piecing that fact into this work of fiction, takes a really careful eye. So I just thought that was really interesting.
I also had a lot of fact checkers. So
That's good to know, the folks behind the scenes.
And they didn't catch that many things, but what they did catch was important. It was some basic things like naming conventions, or I kind of was a little presentist in my naming of people and how names are passed on and stuff like that. And so it was important. It's always good to just have someone look over.
Yeah, it sounds like you were able. It sounds like you were able to direct yourself as far as walking away from research when you really needed to, I guess.
Yeah, I like it, but I do like the research. That's not, to me, it's sort of like laying that foundation and then imagining it. That's the fun part. Because I know I can get lost in it.
Some other questions for Michael?
Yeah. Am I on?
Yes.
Yeah.
I was just wondering how the contemporary world, if it influenced anything in your book, or how the present is. You're looking kind of darkly into the future from your future book, apparently. So I'm wondering whether that had any influence on your book, and the life that you lived in Cairo. It must have had some kind of effect on you when you were writing the book.
Yeah, I mean, the sort of 20th, 21st century section was super based on my time in Cairo. I am not half Muslim, I'm not Egyptian, I'm not gay, but like I wasn't a grad student at the time, but like aside from that, like a lot of Joseph and who he is was very much connected to me. And so that part is really based on that. the thing that was hard for me, and I actually wrote an article about this when it was happening, was while I was writing the book was when the Arab Spring was happening, or rather the Arab Spring was happening while I was writing my book. And at the time, it felt like a real existential crisis for the book. Like, how can you write about Cairo and not include this, you know, earth-shattering historical event that happened? And yeah, it definitely made me sort of like pause and be like, how am I gonna sort of integrate this? And is it, you know, eventually I sort of decided that it wasn't, that wasn't my story that I was writing, and that wasn't necessarily my story to write. And I feel good about that decision. There was another book that actually came out a few years before mine that's also about the Geniza, also set in those same time periods. They're sort of like, you know, the natural time periods to set a book in about the Geniza. And she writes, by Dara Horn, it's called A Guide for the Perplexed. And she writes a lot about the Arab Spring. And I actually haven't read that book, so I don't know how it works. But yeah, it was an interesting moment for me when that was happening, and trying to like kind of decide, okay, how is this all gonna fit in? But in terms of my next book, writing this book was actually really influential in terms of conceiving my next book. In part because I really got to thinking about, you know, just the vast amount of time that Jews were in Cairo, and that it seems almost inconceivable that there would be a vibrant Jewish community in Cairo in 2020. It's hard to imagine. And yet it was really the center of the Jewish world. You know, it was the economic and cultural center of the Jewish world was in Cairo for 200 years. And, you know, the greatest Jewish thinker of all time, Moses Maimonides, has this quote that's the epigraph of the book. You know, for centuries, we've wandered and have finally found a resting place in this city. I'm paraphrasing, but basically that's the idea. And just the idea that this guy, Maimonides, would sort of think that this was like the end of Jewish diaspora, basically, you know, 1,000 years ago, and that it was going to be all good from here on out, and it was in Cairo, just really made me, you know, step back and think about, okay, the long swath of Jewish history, and also what does it mean for our current moment, you know, and for you know, Jews have been in the United States for 350 years, which seems like a heck of a long time, but it's not that long. It's only a third of the amount of time that Jews were in Cairo. So it got me thinking, okay, what's next? And that was kind of the seed to thinking about this next book, and the Book of Esther, which is one of, I think, 2 books in the Jewish Bible that's set in the diaspora, and is very much about the diaspora. And so, you know, how can you kind of reconcile that story with what might happen in the future?
Great. Looks like Megan also said, I also enjoyed reading your book. Did you have any particular audience in mind as you were working on it? And have you returned to Cairo since your semester abroad?
I have returned to Cairo. I probably went back about 4 or 5 times for various reasons, mostly just to visit friends and traveling with friends. And then I went back in 2000, maybe 14, I think. I forget when exactly, to sort of explicitly research the book, and to do that sort of those last little pieces of research that I needed to do on the ground that I couldn't do with Google Maps or, you know, whatever else I was using to research. And did I have a particular audience in mind? Not really. You know, it's definitely connected a lot with a Jewish audience. It's a pretty Jewish book. So that's fine to me, you know. I like Jews, but I also like non-Jews. So, and I'm glad that it's also connected with you know, non-Jewish audiences and audiences around the world. Like I think the most gratified I've felt as an author. You know, I do read my Goodreads reviews. Some people say they don't, but I just feel like they're lying, or I don't know. But anyways, you know, to see the readers in Egypt reading the book, and it just got published in Arabic. So before, it was a lot of readers who were reading it in English, and there was a couple like romance bloggers, like romance book bloggers, who were based in Egypt for some reason, and they read the book. They were like, I'm gonna try something different because it's set in Egypt. And you know, this one woman wrote this really touching review that was just like, you know, there's so little that I read that's about Cairo that feels like it really reflects like what the city is like to me, and just it's so nice to see that. And so that was really lovely, and yeah, just to get that response from the Egyptian readers was really nice, and you know, so oh, and then I see some questions. Do you mind if I just go for it?
Go for it.
So there's the I did not work on the translation. My Arabic is not that good, but there's a really lovely woman who's a translator. She contacted me. She spearheaded the whole thing. And she basically, you know, connected with a publisher who she knew and translated it and got it translated. There's a lot of interest in the Jewish past, and as my old boss who works at the Center for Middle East Studies, who studies Muslim-Jewish relations, said, you know, it's ironic that interest is coming around when there's like the last Jews in the Arab world are dying. But there is a lot of nostalgia and interest for that past, because I think it represents a sort of more cosmopolitan time in the Arab world, in Cairo in particular, and so people have a desire to sort of read about that. Yeah. So I really like that translator. She was very helpful and really, you know, championed the book amongst her sort of literary friends and got it reviewed. And it was in the, like, there's like a Egyptian national literary magazine or something that's run by the government. And they published an excerpt of the book in there. And like, I don't know, to me that feels like a big deal, just to publish a book that is for the government to sort of condone publishing an excerpt of a book that's about Jewish history and about, you know, a gay Egyptian American guy. I was surprised and pleased by that.
Yeah.
And then another question in the chat is about the audiobook. I have no say in who reads the audiobook. The guy who read it is actually like weirdly like an audiobook star, Eduardo Balrini, and he there was like a New York Times magazine cover story written about him, and he was like the fastest rising. He was the fastest audiobook narrator to get like the audiophile gold medal or something like that. Anyways, he people love him, and he seems like the go-to guy to do sort of like more kind of like masculine books set, and anything that's set outside the United States, he narrates for some reason. He's Italian American, but I guess he sort of does Arabic and Persian, and the sort of Near East and Southern Europe is his domain.
Yeah, it's interesting with foreign cultures, dubbed voices, and if that that person in Italy is Robert De Niro for life, and that person something happens to that person, no one accepts the other Robert De Niro as not a real Robert De Niro. So maybe you're locked in with this guy for your career. Hopefully it sounds like it's working for you.
I think he's good. I actually, it speaks to the question, like, at first I was like, he's got a really deep voice, and he's very like, he sounds like someone who would be like, I don't know, like telling a story, about the safari that they went on, in 1984 or something like that. Like, and just felt like a little bit too like, hegemonically masculine for the book. So I was like, I don't know about this guy. And they were like, nope, we're going to use him. Sorry. And I'm glad they did, because he's clearly like a very good audiobook narrator. And I think he did a lovely job with the book.
Great. Well, does anyone else have anything to add? Any extra questions? I think there was a question if there was going to be any kind of cinematic version of this narrative in the works.
Not that I know of, but I welcome that. I accept all comers.
So did you have any, if you could cast the ideal movie for The Last Watchman, would you have an idea of who your ideal actors would be for this?
Literally, I've never thought about that. I don't know.
Okay. We'll put it on the back burner there.
So no, maybe, no, that's a good question. I should think about that.
Yeah, Ariana thinks it would translate beautifully to the screen. So maybe,
Nice.
Yeah, you can use a little bit of journaling time, come up with your ideal cast.
Just tell your executive producer friends.
There you go. There you go. You say that, but you never know who's listening.
Yeah. Putting it out there in the world.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So any further questions before we wrap up and let everyone get back to their evening?
It was just great.
All right.
Thank you so much.
Thank you all for taking the time. I really appreciate it.
Yeah. Thanks so much for donating your time, Michael. And we look forward to your post-apocalyptic Esther work. I don't know. It sounds like some kind of Westworld, Jewish Westworld out there in the.
I will.
Yeah. But it seems like the world today, definitely there's a sci-fi platform / biblical reference to welcome that. But thanks again. And for our alumni here, we do this every month. So next month we do have a graphic novelist who's going to be with us. And he's going to be talking about fortifying democracy, so through comic books. So we'll go ahead and check in with Daniel Newman, class of '91, next month. So thanks again, Michael, and everyone take care.
Thank you.